Yeah.
I'm glad you didn't throw it on me yesterday.
I know. I said I can't do that to him. So, and I really appreciate Sonny last week. I was really looking forward. I was already, that one that we had last week, and we were on vacation just, and I don't, you guys heard about Abby and Gabe getting engaged? And they did that. They came up. Yes. And that was such a blessing. Did you guys see the pictures and everything? Yeah. So that was a lot of fun because we went on vacation and Gabe and I and Carol had it all worked out to surprise Abby. And so there's a whole story behind that I won't go into, but it was a lot of fun and it was really, really sweet and real precious. And but we got a late start, left a day later and everything else, so we ended up extending it. So that's why I was gone last week, and Sonny jumped in there for me. All right, so with that, I'm sick. Who else do we need to pray for, as far as health-wise?
My grandson here, he's sick. They don't know exactly what it is. His stomach hurts. He's been throwing up. They took him to the ER last night. They ruled out an appendix or gallbladder. And they say that it's something, they think it's something with the lymph nodes inflamed around his stomach. There's a term for that, I can't remember. But anyway, but he's still, really, I just talked to her. She said he's still throwing up. He doesn't, the pain is not as bad. So I don't know, they're gonna have to take him to a GI doctor, pediatric GI doctor somewhere.
Well, that is concerning, yeah.
So y'all be aware for me.
Because I heard, I think Linda Ferentz and some other people had some RSV or something like that. Like, I don't even know what I've got, but
Gina is, I guess this coming week gonna start her denture problem, big thing.
wasn't she sick this week also?
I didn't know.
What's that?
I think they were both running fever at some point, and yeah, they're basically wanting that to clear up since Gina's about to go in for surgery. They'll have to delay it if she's having fever.
Yeah, okay. With me, my kidney was hurting. I had a kidney stone many years ago, but I don't know if the fever, the infection started, and so I was like all paranoid about but I took enough ibuprofen to get me through, so. Where's your family?
Taylor Ball over there.
Ah, okay. Thought Abby was doing nursery too. Well, we're having a ladies' Bible study back there or something. Okay. Anybody else? Nope. Rodney, would you open this up in prayer then, please?
Holy Father, we take the time out of our lives to come to this special meeting, read your word, to pursue and understand how it is right through your teaching, profess your name, follow in faith. We come before your throne of grace, Lord, with these prayers. Many have been said,
Amen. Okay. The next slide, please. Once again, with this, last week I was actually going to show you a couple pictures of Ephesus. So maybe I'll show them next week. But back to our map, right? Because that's really going through Acts. A lot of that is, I know you got it in your Bible and everything, but I'm a visual kind of person and everything, and it helps me kind of keep track of where everything is and ties together. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'll probably get done a little bit earlier today. So, because Acts chapter 20, so the last chapter I'll be teaching. And who's next? Is it Ethan? Yeah. But we'll have, about the way to divide this up is pretty clear. You know, we're going to have the first part of it that we're going to talk about on where Paul's going back through some of the places that he's already been, strengthening the churches. We'll talk about that in a minute, where he went and what was going on. And then you get through that part, and then up, of course, the very, once again, famous section in the book of Acts where he's talking to the Ephesian elders. That's what we will be talking about next week, you know, which is a very, very good thing to study about where Paul's heart is and everything for the church. All right, so let's start then. We're going to read Acts chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. It says, "And after the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and when he had exhorted them and taken his leave from them, he departed to go to Macedonia. And when he had gone through those districts and had given them much exhortation, he came to Greece. And there he spent 3 months, and when a plot was formed against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he determined to return through Macedonia. And he was accompanied by Sopater of Berea, the son of Pyrrhus, and of Aristarchus, and Secundus of the Thessalonians, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and Tychicus, and Trophimus of Asia. But these had gone on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. And we sailed from Philippi, and after the days of unleavened bread had come to them at Troas within 5 days, and there we stayed 7 days. And on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to depart the next day, and he prolonged his message until midnight. And there were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered together, and there was a certain young man named Eutychus, sitting in the window sill, sinking into a deep sleep. And as Paul kept on talking, he was overcome by sleep, and fell down from the 3rd floor, and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and fell upon him, and after embracing him, he said, 'Do not be troubled, for his life is in him.' And when he had gone back up and had broken the bread and eaten, he talked with them a long while, until daybreak, and so departed. And they took away the boy alive, and were greatly comforted. But we, going ahead to the ship, set sail for Assos, intending from there to take Paul on board, and thus he had arranged it, intending for himself to go by land. And when he met us at Assos, he took him on board and came to Mytilene. Can't read this morning, pardon me. And sailing from there, we arrived the following day opposite Chios, and the next day we crossed over to Samos, and the day following we came to Miletus. For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus in order that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurrying to be in Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. All right, we'll stop there. Okay. So here we have a whole lot of stuff going on in this short section. And of course, Eutychus is the one that gets a lot of the preaching, right? A lot of sermons on Eutychus. But let's talk about this timeline and where Paul is and everything. So a key thing on here that we see is we know that last Sunday we talked about what Sonny had covered, where Paul was in Ephesus and they had the big uproar going on in Ephesus about the Artemis and the silversmiths and everything that they were trying to do, and how that was infringing upon their business and so forth. And that's why it says in the very first verse, chapter 20, verse 1, says, "And after the uproar had ceased, Paul sent for the disciples when he had exhorted them, and that he was going to leave and depart to go to Macedonia. So, taking a look at right up here, we know where Ephesus is, and his whole idea, I guess that's not as big as I was hoping it was going to look. I'll blow it up next week. But what Paul was doing as he was going through there from Ephesus, then he was going down to Macedonia. Now, Macedonia, if you look on the map, that consisted of Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And so Paul's going through these points. He's going back to these churches that have been established in order to check on them and encourage them. So that's a lot of this part of the third missionary journey. And we remember what kind of things happened, like in Philippi. That's where Paul had his imprisonment, right? The very famous Philippian jailer. So we remember, so he's going back there, and, probably visiting his jailer friend, right? See how he's doing. And then in Thessalonica, we remember as he went through Thessalonica, we got a couple people that's traveling with him from Thessalonica that we're going to talk about in just a minute. And Thessalonica, which is the capital of Macedonia, Paul planted that church, and then he went on to Berea. And of course, Berea, we all know, more noble-minded, right? That was what Berea was famous for. So he's just going right back through these places, in the Macedonian area. And then he gets on to Corinth again, Greece. And so we know this is going to be very important in our church history, because what Paul did, he stayed in Corinth on his way back through this trip for 3 months. And this is where he wrote the book of Romans, talking to the Romans about this is where he's hoping to get to them at some point, which he did, but not in the manner in which he thought. So we have in the Epistle to the Romans, of course, which is like one of the, it's the deepest theological book that we have, like systematic theology in the New Testament. And so I've spent a lot of time going through Romans, probably about 3 times, I think, in a study. And there's so much that you can draw on from Romans. I think everybody knows about that. And that in Corinth, though, when he's in Corinth, that was the very place where, idolatry and immorality, that was like at its zenith right there in Corinth because of how bad they were. And we know that from reading in the book of Corinthians. We talked about how there was actually 4 letters written to Corinthians, but we only have 2. We went through that. You might remember how Paul talks about this other letter, the severe letter and so forth, but that we do not have those letters, but we do have 2 of them. And that's going to be kind of important because as Paul was coming down through Macedonia, you see that he was really concerned. He talks about his concern. He didn't know how the Corinthians were going to receive him, if they were really angry. So it was very, encouraging to Paul when he found out that actually the Corinthians received his rebuke and submitted to what he had said. Okay, and then after the Corinth, then he goes back through Macedonia, and we have his companions that we're going to talk about, and he sails over to Troas, and then Troas is where we're going to meet Eutychus, and then he goes on to Issos, Mytilene, and so forth, because what he's trying to do, remember he says in here that he's trying to reach Jerusalem by Pentecost. That's his goal. Okay. In Troas, let me pick this up, in verse 6, if you want to go chapter 20, verse 6. So that talks about how they had left Philippi, and they get to Troas. Now, you might remember Troas is where Paul had his vision earlier in Acts chapter 16. He thought he was wanting to go one place, but he was told, no, go up to Macedonia. So that happened in Troas. All right, so we had basically all these churches that we just mentioned. I got Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Corinth, Troas, and then Ephesus. So all of those churches, except for Ephesus, were from his second missionary journey that we went through. And then Ephesus was on his third one, and so he's doubling, or circling back to it to talk to them. And what he's doing when he's going through all this is he's collecting an offering for the church in Jerusalem, because the church in Jerusalem is a very poor and under a lot of persecution. So he's trying to get a collection. You also remember, too, even back from Acts chapter 2, there were a lot of people that were from other places that stayed on in Jerusalem. So there's very possibly still some of those people left, that maybe don't have the income that they need or something like that to help support them. So the other thing that's going to be important, too, is as Paul's doing this collection, is it's showing some unity, because you remember in Jerusalem, the church is primarily Jewish, right? And then we have a lot of these converts, and that's a big part of what we've been studying in the book of Acts, is how God is calling in all the Greeks, right? The non-Jews. And we see this where in all these places that Paul's gone, and what has happened, he goes to the synagogue, and he preaches to them, because they would have the Old Testament scriptures, and he explains how Jesus is the Messiah. You have many of the people get upset with him there, but you have some that believe at various levels, as we've talked, our way through his journey. And then, he always seems to end up in jail or getting beaten or something like that when he gets done. That's how he knows it's time to move on, right? So that way he can go on to his next place, recover a little bit for his next beating. But that was a key thing. I think it was also for unification, if you read here, that by Paul collecting this for Jerusalem, it's tying together and showing the people in Jerusalem that they are all brothers and stuff, which is going to be very important. Matter of fact, I'll go ahead and get into that right now. This was something that I did not realize until I was studying for this, and this is why it's always so much fun to study, right? You start going to so many different areas. Something that it's kind of like right there, and some of you probably already might know this. But, so Paul was traveling with people from these different churches, like we read, right? So we had Sopater, he was from Berea, and so he was representing the Macedonian churches. But from Thessalonica, which remember, they were the ones that were not as noble-minded, okay? But they still had some good people there in Thessalonica, but overall they were not as noble-minded as those in Berea. But if you look at the two names of the people that are traveling with Paul from Thessalonica, the two representatives that they sent, we have Aristarchus and Secundus. Now, those two names, what they stand for, if you start thinking about it, the Aristarchus or Aristarchus, aristocracy, he would have been a noble person, a person of means, and someone who was of high standing. So he's traveling with Paul, representing from Thessalonica, that, a representative going to the offering for the Jewish church. Secundus, the one who's traveling with him, that name means second, or number two. So he was, in all likelihood, he was a slave that was a Christian. So here you have that they send these two people, one of them that's the nobleman from Thessalonica of high standing, and Secundus, the slave. And usually the slave that he's talking about here, pardon me, would have been the second underneath the higher slave at the household. So Secundus was a person of low status. Yet here you see the unity within the church of Aristarchus and Secundus, these two people traveling together with Paul in unity. So, I mean, when that just hit me, I don't know if it's, think about it. Paul means small. Yeah. So, anyways, when I read that, though, about how those two guys were traveling together and they were the representatives that from Thessalonica, I just thought that was pretty cool that he would have sent it like that. So, that's right. The grounds lived with the cross. It was very kind of you. I should have done that. I was hoping my cough drop would last me through. And the rest of the people that are mentioned here, they're also nice. Like Gaius, he's from Derbe. And I've noticed it said that he's not to be confused with the other Gaius that was at Corinth. That was a different one. So just like John or Bob or Blaine, there's a lot of common names, right? That was kind of a joke. Okay. And then we have Timothy, of course, you know how prominent Timothy was. Tychicus, you know, he's the one we read earlier. You'll see this in the Ephesians and Colossians. He's the one that delivered those epistles. Tychicus was the one that delivered the epistles, so he's with Paul. So you got a pretty good traveling, you know, group right here. Trophimus, he's the one that later on that they mistake to think he's going to be in the temple, you know, that Paul took him into the temple. And I guess Ethan's going to be getting all into that kind of stuff, so I won't get into that too much. But this is very important because this collection for the poor and everything, and this group of people that are traveling from all around the areas that Paul has been planting churches and stuff, that are now accompanying him back to Jerusalem, was a pretty good representation of the Gentile church, and which is going to kind of get into something I'm going to get into now, which has to do with Paul here in, going back to what I said in verse 6, is where he's in Troas, and we have the whole story of Eutychus and what happens. So first of all, what it talks about is the first day of the week. Now, that actually, when this is using this term for the first day of the week, is only used in 3 places. And it has to do, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong one. The upper room. When it talks about the upper room, that terminology about the upper room is only used in 3 places. It was back in Acts, and then, of course, you know, with Jesus in the upper room, there's a certain way. Now, we know that there's a generic upper room, but this one here is referring back to, like, what we're going to talk about with Peter in just a minute. We're going to see some correlations and why it's important. But the first day of the week, of course, that was the Lord's Day. You know, so he talks about the first day of the week, and they gathered in their upper room. And it says that Paul gave a prolonged message because he knows he was leaving the next day. So, you know, usually it's kind of joked about, you know, about how long a preacher preaches. You know, here he's going all the way to midnight, you know, from about sunset to midnight, and then poor Eutychus falls asleep. Now, the age of Eutychus is talking about, when it says a young man, that word is lad. He was probably somewhere between 8 and 14 years old, you know, based on the words that's used for young lad there. So here, poor Eutychus is somewhere between 8 and 14, and he falls asleep. But you'd also think, too, that this is not just preaching. You know, of course, there is the preaching like we think about what Pastor Brandon does. But this is also teaching. You know, I mean, it could be a question and answer session. It could be all kinds of stuff. Because when you think about where Paul went through and planted these churches, and you read the epistles, a good example like Thessalonians, you know, when you read what was going on in those churches, there was some very specific doctrine and questions and issues. So it's very good, you know, that when they know, you know, can you imagine that, having Apostle Paul here, you know, you're not going to say, well, hey, look, you know, I'm sorry, Paul, it's been an hour, I got to go. You know, you're going to keep him here as long as you could. You know, in our day and time, if we would have had R.C. Sproul or John MacArthur here, you know, we wouldn't tell them, hey, look, you know, you got an hour. And we'd say, how long can you stay? And so the same thing when Paul's there, you know, and he's happy to sit there and just no telling what kind of a doctrinal statement, you know, they could have been talking about all kinds of great things. So, you know, I'm sure people here have done that when you're with somebody and you're talking to them, sharing about the Bible. And, I mean, you just go on for hours and hours just going all over the place in different areas. So I kind of picture it something like that, not just him standing up giving like a, you know, Whitfield-type sermon or something. Okay. But, so he's up there and he's given this and this young lad falls out. Now, we kind of get into something that's really important here that sometimes is missed. So he does fall out of the 3rd floor. That's pretty high, you know, 3rd floor. And he is dead. You'll find some liberals or liberal versions, or some people say that, well, they're not really sure that he was dead and everything else. Well, the language that's in here, he was dead, okay? And we also know this, besides the way that the language is used when it talks about his life being in him, but it says that he was picked up for dead in the New American Standard. But this event is very significant for establishing Paul's credentials. Remember, we talked about back in 19 when Paul comes across some disciples that had been baptized, but they were baptized they were into John's baptism. And so when Paul baptized him, they spoke in tongues. And we noticed that all through the book of Acts, it wasn't that every time somebody got baptized, they spoke in tongues. And you see that throughout the rest of the epistles. This was a very purposeful, significant point that the apostolic authority rested with Paul, because it goes back to the Acts chapter 2 with Peter. And so we saw that in Acts chapter 19. And then we have, here with Eutychus, we have something similar. All right, so seeing somebody speak in tongues, that would be pretty fantastic, wouldn't it? You know, I mean, and I'm talking about the biblical tongues, you know, where they're speaking, you know, somebody walks in here and starts speaking Chinese or something like that to some Chinese person, but they don't know how to speak Chinese. That'd be pretty something. Well, here we have Eutychus that falls out, and he dies. Now, you notice how it says in verse 10, but Paul went down and fell upon him, and after embracing him, he said, do not be troubled, for his life is in him. Like I said, some people might mistake that for, oh, he's not really dead, his life is still in him, but that's not what he's saying. You know, and we're going to take a look at something that shows this. So Paul falls on top of him, it says. Does that probably ring a memory of something? Exactly. And so, oh, I've got some more cough drops. Oh, thank you. Ooh, Fisherman's Friends. I love those. I apologize for my coughing and stuff, guys. Okay, so, and that's exactly right where I was going to go. So we had of Elijah, and think about the places in the in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, where somebody was brought back to life. The person that did that had the strong anointing by God, didn't they? And so we have Elijah. He raised the widow's son. You remember that? And Elisha in 2 Kings 4. Let's go ahead and turn there real quick. Second Kings chapter 4, verses 32 through 37. See if this sounds familiar. When Elisha came into the house, behold, the lad was dead and laid on his bed. So he entered and shut the door behind him, both, and prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay on the child and put his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself on him, and the flesh of the child became warm. Then he returned and walked in the house once back and forth, and went up and stretched himself on him. And the lad sneezed 7 times. The lad opened his eyes, and he called Giza and said, call the Shunammite. So he called her, and when she came to see him, he said, take up your son. Then she went and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground, and she took up her son and went out. Look at how much that was where Paul, in verse 10, fell upon him and embraced him and then brought him back to life. So what this clearly was, I want to go to Acts chapter 9. I would be remiss if I didn't go back to Acts chapter 9. So with Acts chapter 9, and it would be verses 36 through 42. So this is with Peter. So 36 says, now in Joppa there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which translated in Greek is called Dorcas. This woman was abounding with deeds and kindness and charity, which she continually did. And it came about at that time that she fell sick and died. And when they had washed her body, they laid it in an upper room. And since Lydia was near Joppa, the disciples, having heard that Peter was there, sent sent 2 men to him, entreating him, "Do not delay to come to us." And Peter arose and went with them into the upper room. So there's that upper room. This is one of those other places that's what I was making, is that the way that it's talking about the upper room is the same phrase for an upper room here that's different. I think it's 3 places in the New Testament that word is used like this. And all the widows stood beside him and weeping and showing the tunics and garments that Dorcas used to make while she was with them. But Peter prayed and sent them all out and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. And calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known all over Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And it came about that he stayed many days in Joppa with a certain tanner, Simon. Okay, so the point here, and of course Jesus raised many people from the dead. I mean, that is certainly a sign of God on somebody if they're raising somebody from the dead when everybody knows that they are dead. Right? Of course, my favorite, Lazarus, right? We love that story. So here, Paul is going back to Jerusalem. You've got all these witnesses from all these different places, and this happens. And so this is clearly showing God's hand on Paul and confirming him, because you remember one thing about Paul, he wasn't with all the apostles during the time when they walked with Jesus. But he was still taught by Jesus, as we know, right, during that 17-year period, and we talked about that before. So this clearly is to show, just like the ones that were baptized and had the speaking in tongues with the Holy Spirit that Paul had in 19, that referred back to Acts chapter 2, we also have this raising of someone from the dead that harkens all the way back to Elijah and Elijah, Peter in the New Testament, of course, Jesus. But it shows that Paul definitely has that apostolic authority, that there's no doubt who he is, and that's very important. Okay. So with that, we see that Paul is going to continue on. I'll blow the map up so we can see it next time a little bit better. But he's going to, after this, then he's going to continue on down, and so he's going to bypass Ephesus, and that's because if he goes to Ephesus, he knows he's going to get stuck, right? He'll be overwhelmed, and things are going to happen. So we're going to talk next week about how he's going to bypass Ephesus, but he's going to still call for the Ephesian elders. So we're going to hit that next week, pretty heavy. Okay. I'm going to stop there for today. That way you can stop hearing me cough into the microphone. But I thought that, to me it was just even though some of these things are things that people, can read through fairly quickly, but there's just so much depth, just like the names of the ones traveling with Paul. The fact that Paul brings him, Eutychus to life, a lot of times that's, even in sermons, it's just seen as kind of like a little funny thing. Oh, Paul brought him back to life, right? No big deal. But when you understand the depth of God demonstrating his hand upon Paul as his servant, that's pretty significant. Okay. Anybody else have any questions or any comments, anything they'd like to share?
Well, we've got 10 minutes to kill.
I knew you'd have some.
I think it should be noted that verse 7, that they're meeting on the first day of the week. That's when the disciples came together.
Mhm.
Been on Sunday.
Right.
This is the first recorded place in Scripture where it indicates that there's a new day of worship. It is, of course,
Mm-hmm.
Sunday was the first day of the week. It would be what we kind of look at as Monday as Christians. And so it was a day when industry was taking place. People were working, moving about, so that he could have as many people there as possible. It started in the evening, I believe,
Yes.
was the purpose for that. And why such a long sermon? Man, he's convinced this is the last time he's going to see any of these people.
Mm-hmm.
He's leaving early in the morning, the next day, and he's got a lot to share with them. I can just imagine what himself like to it. And I don't think I'm the only one, I might be the only one in this room right now, but I don't think I'm the only one that's ever fallen asleep during a long sermon. But I will give this young man a little bit of leeway here. Not only was it late in the day, and he most likely had spent the day working or doing whatever was required of him at his age. He's on the third floor, or, he's somewhere between 20 to 30 feet up in the air. It's at night. The whole place is lit with oil lamps. So the smoke and gases given off from the oil lamps are going up, and he's up at the top of this thing. So he's breathing, I think he had legitimate reason, not only his youthfulness, the late day, lateness in the day, but the atmosphere itself to have fallen asleep. I think he was probably fighting it as I have before, all the way through, and then was finally just overcome and fell asleep. And so, yeah, 30 feet up in the air, he hits the ground, I'm sure he was dead.
Mm-hmm.
No indication that he was laying there saying, "Oh, man, I hurt my back." He's not yelling out to anybody, he's dead.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. This is so important. Paul had the power to overcome death given by God. Amazing. Everyone would have been amazed. An equal amazing thing is, Paul didn't skip a beat there.
Yeah.
As soon as the young man came back to life, he got up and was given communion.
Yep.
He went right back to preaching, and then he led the whole group in communion. He was like, okay, he's all right. Now, let's get back to the subject at hand. That's amazing.
And,
Strong preaching.
yeah, when Peter talks about, Paul, equating Paul's teaching with Scripture, some things that are hard to understand. Think about the witness to this, where you've got these people from all the churches that, throughout the areas, Asia and Macedonia and stuff like that, and Greece. So you've got these witnesses that are traveling with Paul. They see this, and then at some point, they go back to their homes. And so when letters from Paul come, they can say, "Oh, I was an eyewitness." Yes, because I'm of Apollos, I'm of Paul, I'm this and all that stuff, right, of course. But anyway, so they can talk about the apostolic authority of Paul, that they were there, that they were eyewitnesses to Paul raising somebody from the dead. So as they get Paul's letters, and they're being, when you study the way that the New Testament was put together, that gives a lot of authority, to all those churches that had, because there's witnesses pretty much from all those churches that Paul, was at. All right, anybody else? Okay. So I'm not just coughing. Would you please close us in prayer? Thank you.